They are being interrogated, and all roads lead to the U.S. State Department, who have been directing Ukrainian forces since their 2014 coup. Weeks before the attack, Victoria Nuland repeatedly boasted that Putin was in for a nasty surprise.
Mr. Putin's going to get some nice surprises on the battlefield, and that Ukraine will make some very strong success this year. This supplemental funding will ensure Putin faces some nasty surprises on the battlefield this year.
On March 7th, the U.S. Embassy issued a warning about the threat of terrorist attacks in Moscow, specifying concerts. The British Embassy in Moscow mirrored this warning. Days before the attack, Barack Obama paid an unexpected visit to the British Prime Minister at 10 Downing Street. Within hours of the attack, and without any evidence, the U.S. government blames the attack on the Islamic State and says that Ukraine is not involved. The very next day, while Russians were grieving, CIA mouthpiece The Washington Post gloated how the U.S. had prior knowledge of the attack and people still died. It has been noted that the terrorists were either professional assassins or trained by Western forces.
Does the U.S. control ISIS, and by implication other Islamic terrorist organizations? Certainly not all of them, but if so, what are the implications of that? If so, then how can we separate ourselves from what they do? If so, isn't their terror our terror? Now, it isn't disputed that we originally created these organizations back in the 80s. Everyone acknowledges that. But if we continued some measure of control over them, isn't every terror attack, or at least the major ones, a false flag which we have executed? And it's not that we haven't done it before. Just look at the video I did recently over Operation Gladio, where we created fake communist terror groups to attack civilians in Europe. And that's an established fact. We did that. So if we do it then, why not now? Has anything changed in the character of people? Of course, that's not to say that all the terrorists know this. They may think they're doing precisely what they say they are. But that doesn't preclude a certain measure of control by us. After all, there are a lot of people who think that the guy who started ISIS, al-Baghdadi, was one of our people, or rather a Mossad operative. So anyway, I'm going to look at this and explore it a little more. The information, the sources are kind of sketchy sometimes, but I'm going to explore this, and then at the end we're going to talk about it, the implications.
We created ISIS. I mean, ISIS is no less than the people up in Islamberg, no less than Gulen, is a CIA creation. John McCain, for heaven's sake, was over there with the ISIS officials. We created them. They came from the Al-Nusra group, the Syrian Liberation Front. These two organizations combined, and they morphed into ISIS. It's our creation. We create them. We still direct them. When ISIS warriors are injured in battle, where are they transported? They're transported, for heaven's sake, to Israel. They're treated by the Israelis in Israeli hospitals and brought back to battle.
Well, plenty of the rebels have acknowledged that they've been supported by Israel, and they've thanked Israel for helping them. Yeah. In fact, arms are oftentimes caught. Israeli arms are caught on route to the rebel.
U.S. and Western policy in the conflagration that is now the Middle East is the classic model of imperial divide and conquer, or divide and rule. The U.S. has certainly exploited the existence of ISIS against other forces in the region as part of a wider drive to maintain Western control. A year into the Syrian rebellion, the U.S. and its allies weren't only supporting and arming an opposition they knew to be dominated by sectarian groups, they were prepared to countenance the creation of some sort of Islamic State, despite the grave danger to Iraq's unity as a Sunni buffer to weaken Syria. Raising the possibility of establishing a declared or undeclared Salafist principality, a Pentagon report stated, This is exactly what the supporting powers to the opposition want, in order to isolate the Syrian regime, which is considered the strategic depth of the Shia expansion, Iraq and Iran. So essentially, we allowed ISIS to be instituted. We may have even actually impelled ISIS to be instituted as a means of attacking Syria and destabilizing the government there.
هذا اسمك الحقيقي واسمك الحركي في ليبيا؟
محمد ياسر أبو علاء.
محمد ياسر أبو علاء. جنسيتك؟
سورية.
ديانتك؟
يهودية.
عملك؟
ملازم أول موساد.
عملك؟
ملازم أول موساد.
أمتى جندت في الموساد؟
سنة 2002 ألف عام.
أمتى دخلت إلى ليبيا؟
في عام 2012.
الغرض.
Now there's old al-Baghdadi out there on point there, and there are a whole lot of respectable heavy-hitter people who seem to think that he was working for the Mossad and ultimately, of course, Israel and the United States. And he was leading ISIS. I should have gone into more depth about old al-Baghdadi, but I didn't want the video to get too long. Suffice it to say, there are a lot of respectable opinions that seem to think that that's precisely what he was. The DIA, Defense Intelligence Agency, is one of 16 U.S. military intelligence agencies. According to a leaked document obtained by Judicial Watch, the DIA wrote on August 12, 2012, that there is the possibility of establishing a declared or undeclared Salafist principality in eastern Syria, and this is exactly what the supporting powers to the opposition want in order to isolate the Syrian regime. The supporting powers to the opposition referred to are Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and the GCC nations such as Qatar, who are in turn being supported by the U.S., UK, Israeli axis in their struggle to overthrow Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. Maybe I should have put a picture of Alice in Wonderland going through the looking glass there instead of those guys. Because, believe me, up is down and down is up. Now, let's go back and look at some of the recent history of the region to perhaps get maybe a clearer perspective on what's going on. Because, after all, the past is prologue, and it is. Before Russia militarily entered Syria, the U.S. claims it was attacking ISIS. Yet Russia was able to do in a few months what the U.S. had been unable to do for years. Why? Is the U.S. military that incompetent? Or is this further proof that the U.S. has been funding and supporting ISIS all this time? At one point, there were even reports that U.S. soldiers were told not to fire on ISIS targets, even if they had a clear view of them, as this Free Beacon article reports. U.S. military pilots who've returned from the fight against the Islamic State in Iraq are confirming that they were blocked from dropping 75% of their ordnance on terror targets because they could not get clearance to launch a strike, according to leading members of Congress. Isn't it more than highly strange and suspicious that ISIS never attacks Israel, or the U.S. for that matter? That's another indication that ISIS is controlled by them. If ISIS were a genuine and independent uprising that was not covertly orchestrated by the U.S. and Israel, why would they not try to attack the Zionist regime, which has attacked almost all of its Muslim neighbors ever since its inception in 1948? The only time of which I'm aware of ISIS's attack in the United States was the Las Vegas massacre. They claimed responsibility for it, but I also just did a video recently showing how that was just a great big false flag. So once again, that even tends to indicate that we control them.
ISIS is honoring President Obama. He is the founder of ISIS. He's the founder of ISIS. Okay, he's the founder. He founded ISIS. And I would say the co-founder would be crooked Hillary Clinton.
I'm going to go over 5 examples that would seem to indicate that we control ISIS. And the first one is that we've been used to fight as ISIS's air force on more than one occasion. But the main one was when U.S. warplanes led British, Danish, and Australian jets on a series of airstrikes against the Syrian Arab army. The air raids lasted about an hour and decimated crucial Syrian army positions on the mountains that overlooked Deir el-Zor's airport. The airstrikes killed at least 62 Syrian soldiers and injured over 100 more. Immediately following the airstrikes, ISIS fighters attacked the weakened Syrian troops defending the critical mountains. ISIS ultimately overran the positions on the mountains, threatening both the air base and the city's roughly 200,000 residents, granting safe passage to endangered ISIS units. The Raqqa deal is a secret agreement between the U.S.-backed Kurdish Syrian Democratic Forces and ISIS. Roughly 4,000 ISIS fighters were bussed out of the city with their families and weapons. U.S. officials made the decision in consultation with the SDF. While the U.S. and Kurds intended to keep the deal secret for obvious reasons, news quickly broke when disgruntled truck drivers talked to the press. Since they were hired under false pretenses, the truck drivers were quite surprised to discover that their cargo included heavily armed terrorists laden with suicide belts. And it wasn't just that. They were taking their wives, their sex slaves. They were taking the whole kit and caboodle out of that city, to escape the consequences of their villainous perfidy. Number 3, supplying sophisticated anti-tank weapons to the terrorist groups. So they gave TOW missile launchers to these guys. TOW stands for tube-launched, optically sighted, wire-guided. They're extremely effective. According to a 2014 Washington Post article, the U.S. provided many of these launchers to the self-described moderate rebel groups like Harakat Hazim, or Movement of Steadfastness, which later joined hardline extremist Levant Front. In the case of Harakat Hazim, the group joined the extremist Levant Front just a year after receiving the U.S. TOW launchers. The Levant Front is a broad coalition consisting not of ISIS fighters per se, but still containing fighters under the banner of numerous terror organizations within its ranks. So essentially, you're going to give, you create plausible deniability by giving the launchers to the so-called moderate terrorists, knowing that they would fall into the hands or be transferred to the more extreme, and eventually ISIS, of course, would get them. I mean, how could they not know that? Had to have been deliberate. Number 4, likely arming terrorists with surface-to-air weapons. One of the most devastating weapons available to ISIS and ISIS-adjacent forces are man-pads, shoulder-fired anti-aircraft rocket launchers. Man-pads are the Russian equivalent to our Stinger missiles. Ample video evidence displays fighters of every rebel group from ISIS to Al-Qaeda in Syria using such weapons to devastating effect. One video even shows ISIS fighters with U.S.-made Javelin rocket launchers. While it is possible these weapons were simply captured, some evidence points to the weapons being supplied by the U.S. Many foreign policy experts suggest that the U.S. and its allies have quietly supplied these devastating anti-aircraft weapons to the Syrian rebels. Such an operation would be relatively easy to cover up, as the U.S. has a large amount of Soviet-made man-pads looted from Iraq and Syria. 5. Using Turkey and Saudi Arabia as proxies to funnel support to ISIS. Perhaps the largest and most obscure way that the U.S. helps ISIS and other terror groups is through the middlemen like Turkey and Saudi Arabia. The U.S. gives extensive military intelligence and financial aid to these regimes and then funnels those resources toward ISIS. Saudi Arabia, another U.S. ally, covertly supports ISIS while publicly opposing the terror group. According to a report by the British government, Saudi Arabia supplied ISIS with major financing. The study found evidence of Turkey providing military equipment, transport, and logistical assistance, training, and medical care to ISIS fighters. But that's not all. The study determined that Turkey supports ISIS financially through purchasing oil and assisting ISIS recruitment. Even the neoconservative Brookings Institute admits that Saudi Arabia's contribution to Islamic extremism has far outstripped Iran's. Hillary Clinton, one of Saudi Arabia's staunchest supporters in the U.S., has privately admitted that Riyadh supports ISIS. If they were doing it back then, what makes you think they're not still doing it now? Twice recently, ISIS has attacked Russia, the Russian Federation. There was the Crocus City massacre at that big movie theater. And then just yesterday, ISIS attacked, what was it? 2 churches and a synagogue, slaughtering a bunch of helpless folks. And as far as the Crocus City massacre is concerned, on March 7th, more than 2 weeks prior to the tragedy, U.S. intelligence already knew of a potential attack in Moscow. Enough for the U.S. State Department to issue a public advisory to Americans in Russia, warning personnel that both the U.S. and U.K. embassies of probable terrorist attacks in Moscow at large public gatherings, including concerts. A day later, on March 8th, Reuters reported the U.S. Embassy in Russia warned that extremists had imminent plans for an attack on Moscow, hours after Russian security services said they had foiled a planned shooting at a synagogue by a cell from the Afghanistan arm of Islamic State. So we knew about it. We warned our people. Why didn't we warn them? Why didn't we warn the Russians? And then yesterday, that deal. Now, what do you think the Russians are going to do? They know this. They know damn well that we're behind it. They publicly say that they think we're behind it. What do you think they're going to do? Tit for tat. They're going to have to escalate. And then, of course, we had the Las Vegas massacre. ISIS claimed responsibility for that, and of course, that dovetailed right into the government's agenda to try to confiscate people's firearms and disarm the American people. 20 minutes before the whole thing started, a woman came out and started yelling that everybody's going to get killed. So somebody knew about it in advance. Just look at that video. There were a lot of people knew about it in advance. This is dirty pool, people. After researching this video, I felt like I needed to go take a shower, for crying out loud. I am ashamed to be a citizen of this country.
Back home now to the terror arrests across the country. We've learned several men with suspected ties to ISIS living in the U.S. have been taken into custody. Julia Ainsley is with us with more. Julia, what happened?
Lester, the 8 suspects are men from Tajikistan who were all arrested by ICE over the weekend in Philadelphia, Los Angeles, and New York. Sources familiar with the matter tell us the men crossed the southern border, some over a year ago.
Look, the FBI is trying to do everything they can to sound the alarm. What the Biden administration is doing, what the Democrats is doing, is reckless. It is dangerous. Martha, sadly, I believe we are at a greater risk today of a major terrorist attack than we have been any time since September 11th.